Great. So I'm here with Ben Jarman, the 2024 Swarthmore Lecturer, who will be delivering his lecture, Getting What We Deserve, Imprisonment and the Challenge of Doing Justice, as part of Britain Yearly Meeting 2024, which will be held at Friends House, London, later this month. So Ben, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Aled. Well, my name's Ben Jarman. I am a member of Westminster Meeting, although I've recently moved away from London, so I'm kind of not quite don't know what meeting I'm part of at the moment. My job is that I'm a researcher. I work on imprisonment. I've previously worked for organisations in the voluntary sector that worked with people during and after they served prison sentences. I am the dad of a toddler. I have been a teacher in the past. So yeah, I've done lots of different things, but I've been working in and around the world of prisons now for about the last 15 years.
Okay, great. So you touched on it a bit, but can you tell us a bit about how you came to Quakerism and your journey with friends?
Sure. Well, I didn't grow up a Quaker. I grew up going to church with my parents in sort of fairly ordinary Church of England church, which I stopped going to when I was a teenager. It just stopped kind of meaning something to me. I started going to Quaker meetings, I think in 2005. And it was a succession of, I think I'd had quite a sheltered, comfortable life up until that point. And it was a succession of really difficult things that happened sort of one after the other. A friend of mine was the victim of quite a serious crime, and her life kind of fell apart as a consequence of that. And I think that was the initial thing that pushed me to really just a feeling that I didn't really know how to cope with this stuff, and I didn't really know what life meant when things like that happened. And by coincidence, around that time, I met someone, a friend of hers actually, who was a Quaker, and who said, I said, does that help? And this friend of hers said that she didn't really know if it helped or not, but it was really useful to have some quiet time sitting in meeting. And I thought, well, that sounds quite nice. And I remembered that where I grew up in London, the Quaker Meeting House, Forest Hill Quaker Meeting House, was opposite the house of a childhood friend of mine who I'd known when I was much littler. And so I thought, oh, I know where there's a Quaker meeting. And I went to that Quaker meeting, and the silence of meeting really sort of helped. And I kind of carried on going there for a bit. I moved around quite a lot over the following years. So for a while I attended Young Friends General Meeting. I found that a really good introduction to Quakerism. I started going to that not long afterwards, actually. I then worked for a while in Brussels for the Quaker Council for European Affairs a few years after that. And I'd say that I kind of really settled into a particular meeting. I had been attending Westminster Meeting for some time, sort of on and off, but I'd moved, as I said before. And then in 2011, I moved back from Brussels, and I started attending Westminster regularly. And I've been going there for most of the last 15 years or 13 years since then, until I moved in January. And I think my journey with friends, I think initially I came to Quakerism with quite a feeling of crisis, a sort of crisis of meaning in my life, and not really understanding, to put it in cliche terms, why terrible things happen to good people. And another thing I didn't mention was that sort of after I'd initially come to terms with what had happened to my friend, later that year, two other friends of mine who were both the same age as me, I was in my mid-20s at the time, they both died in different circumstances. And yeah, I just found over time that having space in which to reflect and to let these kinds of things sink in, rather than to sort of give me easy answers, was very, very helpful. And I've always found that. I've always found returning to meeting a kind of a sort of a way in which I make sense of what's going on for me in the rest of my world. And I think how I would characterize my journey with friends more generally is that I actually haven't done, apart from that year working for QCEA, I haven't done a lot of my work with Quakers or in a kind of official Quaker way. I haven't been a professional Quaker, so to speak. I've been involved in my meeting and things, but it has been something that's very much informed how I go about my work and the kind of selfhood I take out into the world that I have. So yeah, I think it's become very important to me, but it's also, it's not something that I kind of associate with a particular sort of agenda or a particular set of politics. I'm not a sort of very activist person and things like that. So yeah, that would be my summary of it.
Okay, great. And can you tell us a bit about how you got involved in prisons and criminal justice?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the incident I mentioned with my friend actually was that was left me with some questions. I could understand it was a situation where the police didn't take it further. I could understand why they didn't take it further, but that didn't look like justice to me. My mum had done a little bit of volunteering in prison for a charity called Fine Cell Work, which I later went on to work for 10, 12 years later. When I was a teenager, she was doing that. And when I was a teenager, I just thought it was one of the embarrassing things that my mum did, as you do when you're a teenager. You think everything your parents do is a bit daft. But so I'd always been slightly aware, I suppose, that that there was that sometimes people got involved in going into these places. And then when I ended up working in Brussels for Quaker Council for European Affairs, I took over a piece of kind of nearly finished work from another previous program assistant, my predecessor. And that was a piece of research on how different countries grappled with the problem of reintegrating people into society at the end of their prison sentence, which in a way is what the lecture is going to be about. And I found that research very interesting. I reread it again not long ago, and I still think it stands up, actually. I still think it's a good piece of work. Although the other thing I reflected when I read it again was, goodness, how confident I sound in this. And I've never even been to a prison at that point, and I don't think I've met anybody who's been to a prison. So I do have a sort of slight embarrassment about not really having earned the right to have a say. So very much a kind of intellectual exercise. But I think the thing that I particularly took from it, there was one particular piece of Quaker work which was described in that, which at that time had recently stopped being a piece of Quaker work. It had been laid down, but that was something called Circles of Support and Accountability. And Quakers piloted that in the UK. It was an idea that originated in Canada. And what it involved was organizing groups of volunteers from the community who would work with, as part of a circle, kind of with somebody who was usually a high risk sexual offender who'd been released from prison. And the idea of it was that these are people who are very, very, very stigmatized, and who that stigma can be a risk of them falling back into behavior that they've been involved in before, because it kind of makes it seem as if as if they don't belong anywhere, and therefore the kind of standards that the rest of society is expecting them to uphold maybe don't mean as much. And I found that example, and some of the reading I did about it and a few of the people I talked to about it, I've just found it fascinating. I thought it was such a kind of an interesting way of responding to what is a very real problem, as I've kind of come to understand through subsequent work. So yeah, I did all of that, but as I say, it felt like a bit of an intellectual exercise at QCA, and I came back to London to work for a charity called Clinks. They are a membership organisation, and they represent the sort of voice of the wider voluntary sector, of the charitable sector, and its work in criminal justice. And I was involved in writing resources, policy advice, writing resources on good practice in volunteer management and stuff like that. My roles there, I actually worked in 2 stints for them, one between 2011 and 12 and one between 2015 and 16. And my work all related to volunteering. And I think that was something that kind of made me, the major thing I picked up through that was a sense of the importance, both to prisons as institutions, but also very directly to prisoners, of the idea that the outside world kind of remains interested in these places. So the projects that I was writing about and producing case studies of and things were all projects which in one way or the other involved volunteers either mentoring people when they were released from prison or organizing activities in prison, and a lot of that, a lot of the feedback we got from that focused on the idea that it kind of brought a slice of normality into places which are not very normal and are quite out of the ordinary, and it relieved something of what was heavy about them. So I found that quite interesting. And then for 3 years in the middle of that, I worked for this charity, Find Cell Work. And that was much more practical, much less research and policy based. They are an interesting project. They were set up by a very privileged aristocrat called Lady Anne Tree, who was very keen on embroidery and textile art, and who in the 1960s had the idea of paying people in prison to do textile commissions. And back in the 1960s, she worked as a prison visitor. Back in the 1960s, it wasn't allowed to pay people for that kind of work, and she thought that it should be, and embarked on a 20-year campaign to get the rules changed so that it would be possible to pay people, and eventually set up this charity that did this. And we worked in when I was there, about 20 prisons, all around the country, prisons from high to minimum, from maximum to minimum security, mostly men's prisons, but one or two women's prisons. And we had groups that were led and organized by volunteers, most of whom were the sort of middle and upper class, fairly well off, often retired women who do a lot of embroidery. My mum now does a lot of embroidery, and I'm sure it's that kind of person. And they went in, and on the face of it, it looked as if a lot of the people they worked with were serving very long sentences, including life sentences, for very serious offences. And on the face of it, it looked as if what was going on was textile art and embroidery and tapestry. And often the men and women who did it became extremely skilled, and the charity could take on some very complicated and very kind of creative commissions for artists and things like that. So the work really spoke for itself and was kind of amazing. And it sort of had this real visual power a lot of the time, because some of it is extremely fine work, and people will look at it and kind of go, I can't believe it. Was that made in prison? Really? Was it made by men in prison? Really? But also, when I went to visit the groups, I kind of understood more of that idea about the idea that the outside world it is really significant, particularly in long-term prisons, and the idea that some part of you still exists in the outside world, that you have some stake in the outside world. For people who are spending decades in prison is really important. And I've got a couple of kind of examples of this. One is that we were one of the sort of few organizations or businesses. It was a social enterprise, and it was one of the few businesses or organizations that could take on large scale kind of handmade embroidery and tapestry commissions. And one of the customers for those was churches, and they would give us commissions to produce like large batches of kneelers, those kind of embroidered things that go on the back of pews. And I remember talking to a man in one of our groups at Dovegate, which is a prison in Staffordshire, sort of long-term, medium to high security prison. And he was a lifer, and I don't know how long he'd been in prison, but Dovegate is a prison where you're not in Dovegate if you're close to release. And as part of this commission, we sent out the tapestry kits, and we put instructions in with the kit that said you can embroider anything that you want that's meaningful to you on one edge of the kneeler. So the kneelers were a standard design, but it would kind of have this kind of individual aspect. And it just happened that he was working on this when I visited the group that was run by the volunteers there. And he said to me something I've never forgotten, which is that he said he'd stitched his daughter's initials. He wasn't in touch with his daughters. I don't know whether that was because of his offence or anything else, but he'd stitched his daughter's initials into the edge of a kneeler. And he said that because his daughter's initials were on the edge of a kneeler, which was in a church somewhere in West London, that meant that he sort of still existed in the outside world. And I just kind of thought, like, it really, really stayed with me. I remember thinking about that on the train back home and just thinking, like, what a tiny thing that was. And yet what a massive thing that was to him. And it's always stayed with me, that, because it kind of reminded me about what it is to have everything, to lose everything, and then to find that, like, you kind of have to put something in its place. And yeah, I still find that very sad. As I say, I don't know what it was that put that man in prison, although I do know that he was serving a life sentence, so it wouldn't have been something trivial. But it kind of, I guess what I'm getting at is the idea that that kind of work and having some sort of involvement in the outside world is from the perspective of long-term prison, where people are just shut away for a very, very, very long time. Having that kind of involvement, or feeling that there's that kind of interest or something of that nature coming in, can be a lifeline for people. And so at the same time, there's also my work there kind of also sometimes made me realize that there are some very deep stigmas attached to imprisonment, and particularly to long-term imprisonment. It wasn't by design. It wasn't a sort of intentional thing, but it was a kind of a consequence of, I think, where we got pigeonholed sometimes by the prison service, that we often worked in prisons or parts of prisons holding a lot of men convicted of sexual offences. And I remember we did this massive commission, one of the biggest, most exciting things that we were involved in during my time there, which was a huge, I think it was in the end about 13 or 14 meters long and about 1.5 meters wide. So sort of 40, 50 foot piece of embroidery, which was displayed in the British Library and was commissioned to mark the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And it was a massive enterprise to get the thing done. It took about 1.5 years, and it was just a huge, huge job. And it was worked on by 30, 40 prisoners in 9 or 10 different prisons, and it came back in different pieces, and then it had to be put together. And we had to get 2 pieces of every bit made because things so often went missing, and so on and so on and so on. And I remember going to the opening at the British Library, and there were lots of famous people there. I still remember because I met Jarvis Cocker because he was there. I don't know why he was there, but I met Jarvis Cocker and got a selfie with Jarvis Cocker and sent it to my sister. And it was a very exciting thing, and it was amazing to see it in its display case and to think that this had been worked on in prisons across the country. And then one of the people who was at the event, I don't know who she was, I overheard her saying to the person she was there with, as she was peering over the display case looking at this thing, "Do you think they've had any sex offenders working on this?" And the friend said to her, "No, I'm sure they wouldn't let that happen. I'm sure because there are children coming here." And I just remember thinking, that's really interesting that someone would kind of think there's this kind. It made me realize that people have very, very powerful kind of emotions and kind of taboos and boundaries around emotions like disgust and things like that around certain types of offending. And that's part of why prisons are the way they are. But yeah, I just remember thinking at the time, well, how do you think this embroidery that's actually shut in a glass case is going to, there's kind of magical thinking going on there. And there's something that quite unexamined, I thought, but quite interesting. So yeah, that was, a very interesting environment, and it was also, and I'll say, it was also kind of quite involved in how I ended up looking at prisons as a researcher and being interested in the kind of the world and the experience of very, very long-term imprisonment.
Yeah, do you want to talk a bit more about how, that move from kind of working it to deciding to take on some research in the area, kind of what was your experience and what kind of discoveries did you make during your time?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you can probably already tell that I found this I was kind of by then finding this world like very, very interesting, and realizing that it was quite a different world, and not a world that was very well understood and didn't match the way that I think a lot of people sort of thought about it. And I particularly, towards the end of my time at Fine Cell Work, we started piloting some work, working with some people after they'd been released. And one of the people who we, as a pilot, we had coming to work with us, he was released from prison, and he had gone to prison in 1978. I was born in 1981, and this happened in, I think, 2013 or 2014. So he'd been in prison for 34, 35 years, and I was in my early 30s at the time. So he'd literally been there longer than I'd been alive. And I just couldn't really get my head around it. I got to know him quite well. We worked with him. He didn't really know anybody outside prison. That was one thing that I found quite mind-boggling, was what would it be like? How would you just come out and you've gone to prison before, I mean, way before the internet, before mobile phones, before debit cards, and you come out, and I just kind of found him very inspirational and very interesting. I had some interesting conversations with him. He didn't struggle with the stuff that I thought he would struggle with. He struggled with some other things. One of the things I remember him saying was that he couldn't believe, this really surprised me, and it really stayed with me. Another thing that stayed with me, he said, "I can't believe how rude people are out here to each other." And I just kind of thought, well, so I talked with him about that. And I think I kind of asked him, because people, the stereotype people have of prisons, and it's true of some of them, but it's not equally true of all of them, is that they're kind of chaotic, violent, rough places. And what he meant was that prisons push people into very close quarters with each other. There's a sort of intimacy. It's not necessarily a wanted intimacy, but there's an intimacy to being in prison. And, but also some of the people you're pushed into close quarters with aren't people you necessarily trust or want to be there with. And so minor sort of politeness, acknowledgement, respect, being able to be a judge of character, being able to tell when someone's having a bad day and they might be liable to fly off the handle, are very, very important. So it was just little things like that. And and then I started reading some research about long-term imprisonment that had been done from within the department where I later went on to do my master's and my PhD. And I just found that some of the stuff I was reading about really described this colleague of mine really well. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I could go and do some research about this. So I was, if you like, I was kind of drawn a little bit towards trying to get a bit closer and trying to understand more. And that led me to go and do first a master's. The second piece of work I did with Clinks, I did as a piece of freelance work, and it gave me a sum of money that I could afford to pay for a master's. So I thought I'd go and do that. And then eventually I managed to get funding to do a PhD. And I did a PhD, which is focused on the ethical experiences of people serving life sentences for murder, men serving life sentences for murder. And I carried out, in total, across the pilot and the PhD itself, I carried out over 60 interviews, with long interviews, sort of life history interviews with people at various stages of their sentence who'd been convicted in different circumstances, and was just trying to understand what it meant to them, not just to be in prison, but what it meant to them to be in prison for the things that they had been convicted of, if that makes any sense. So I was interested in kind of what are the moral messages people are getting from this kind of really, really drastic punishment that is a life sentence. Maybe people will understand this, maybe they won't, but if you're given a life sentence, it doesn't always mean that you will spend the rest of your life in prison, except in a very small number of cases. But mostly it means that you're given a minimum amount of time that you have to serve in prison, which is supposedly calibrated to reflect how serious what you did was. And then after that, you may be eligible to apply for parole, in which case you are released if the parole board thinks it is not necessary for the protection of the public that you stay in prison. So there's a point where you're being punished, formally, legally speaking, and then there's a point where you're being kept in prison to protect the public, again, formally, legally speaking. And I was kind of interested in how people thought about these experiences, how they thought about wrongdoing, how they thought about what you should do with yourself if you've done something terrible, whether they thought they'd done something terrible, questions like that. And also how the different ways that people's previous lives affected what they thought was wrong or not wrong about the murders that they were in prison for, if that makes sense. Because murder is a very unusual crime in some ways, because it's a very broadly defined crime in the law, and so a lot of different things come under that heading. You don't have to have meant to kill someone to be convicted of murder. The jury has to believe that you meant them harm and that they died because of your actions. So in English law, euthanasia is murder. Punching someone and then falling over and banging their head and dying as a result of that is murder, potentially. Serial killing is murder. Abduction and rape is murder. Abduction and rape and killing someone is murder. So all of these things are quite variable, but you all get given the same label and given the same punishment and kind of flattened out into one group. So the research is kind of interested in that, I suppose, among other things.
Okay, and I'm sure you'll expand a bit more on that in the lecture as well. And just before we go into the, you're going to deliver the lecture later this month. But I just wondered if you'd want to use this as an opportunity to give maybe a bit of context, Quaker context, to the lecture that you're going to do, and speak a bit about the historic Quaker witness around criminal justice.
Yeah. This is something I didn't know an awful lot about before I started doing the lecture. And it's something that actually has kind of informed the lecture, but is not, for space reasons, there isn't going to be a lot of in the lecture. But it's something I've always been conscious of ever since I've been a Quaker working in and around prisons. And especially when I was a professional Quaker for QCEA, we often made a lot of our past involvement in prison reform and in penal reform more generally, and in the criminal justice system. It's taken a lot of different forms over the years, though, and I think it's possible to exaggerate the sort of coherence of it, or to sort of it's possible to exaggerate the extent to which there is one tradition there. But some of the things I've read about and found interesting, the origin of it, like where we first, as Quakers, became interested in prisons, was a very practical thing, which was that in the very early days of Quakerism, Quakers were thrown in prison a lot as a result of their faith, and that was part of the persecution of Quakers. And a lot of what they did in those early days wasn't really to question the nature of the system as such. There's a criminologist who's also a Quaker called Mike Nellis who's written about this, and he points out that George Fox didn't really question the legitimacy of the state punishing people in general, but he thought, because of seeing what happened to people in prison, that the punishments were massively disproportionate and weren't the best way of dealing with it. So the early Friends were involved, and they were close because they knew people who were suffering the effects of the system as it operated, and their involvement was very practical, and it was involved in providing care of different sorts for people for the effects of the system. And then later, this was probably the thing that I found out that I was the most surprised by, was that Quakers in America were really centrally involved in inventing the use of prison as a punishment. And that I didn't know before. What I mean by that is, before then, prisons weren't used the way they are today. They were used to keep people in one place, ready for when they were put to trial. But And that was when the early Quakers were thrown in prison. It was because they were being held, waiting for a touring judge to come round and put them on trial. But prisons weren't used as a punishment. The punishments in those days were mostly capital or corporal punishment, or sometimes banishment of one kind or another, being transported to a penal colony or various things. The punishments were really, really, really harsh. And some Quakers in Philadelphia, in America, thought that the punishments were too harsh and that this was not the best way of dealing with it, and thought that punishment could reform people and could change them. And Quakers in Philadelphia were centrally involved in the first use of prisons as a place of punishment. They helped to invent the penitentiary, as it was known at the time. And they also helped to invent what we now think of as something inherently problematic and dangerous and damaging and harmful, which is solitary confinement, as we now term it. I'm going to read a little quote here. This is from a British observer who was sent by the Home Office to go and look at the new way that they were doing prison imprisonment in the US in the 1830s. He was called William Crawford, and he was sent to go and find out about these new penitentiaries and how they worked. And he described what they had set up and how it worked and how it was supposed to reform people. He said, "Day after day, with no companions but his thought, the convict is compelled to reflect and listen to the reproofs of conscience. He's led to dwell upon past errors and to cherish whatever better feelings he may at any time have imbibed." And although the Quakers by that point had kind of moved on from the original idea they'd created, that idea, I just find it fascinating that having moved away by then Quakers were in positions of power and wealth and influence. They were not being persecuted. They were not on the receiving end of the system. They were not needing, I think, to care for people who were being imprisoned. And it just says something interesting that their instinct was to take this idea of silence and silent reflection, which is something that was helpful to them and useful to them and that was part of their spirituality, and to kind of decide that that's the answer for everybody else as well, and to kind of impose it. So, yeah, I think that's where I found that such an interesting example, because it sort of showed how insidious it can be to kind of blend sort of kindness with coercion, if that makes any sense. I think one of the things I'm going to talk about in the lecture is that how difficult it is to change people through coercion. And I think that example kind of gives you that. After that was the early 19th century. From then, there's a long period where Quakers were involved. Mike Nellis, the criminologist who I mentioned before, calls this a very patrician form of involvement. And on both sides of the Atlantic, I think Quakers were quite involved in kind of being influential, getting involved in committees. They were advocating for kind of humane changes and alternatives to imprisonment, and to kind of finding ways to soften the impact of those kind of really heavy forms of punishment that existed. Quite a lot of Quakers were in the late 19th, early 20th century involved in setting up the work of probation, which was a kind of new thing at the time. This idea that the government would appoint people to supervise people in the community rather than sometimes after sending them to prison. And so probation was seen as a kind of an alternative to imprisonment. And then, subsequently, I think the kind of the Quaker tradition and the Quaker witness, that there's been an involvement very recently, or not very recently, but sort of since the 1990s, a lot of Quakers have been involved in trying to think around alternatives to punishment. They've been involved in restorative justice work and kind of conflict resolution work, and trying to posit alternative ways of dealing with the conflicts that crime entails. And then, more in the US than here, I think there's been a couple of quite more radical sort of approaches in the last 50 or so years. One particular example I found, and I did know about this before I started reading for the lecture, because it's quite widely cited in criminology in the history of imprisonment, and it's very widely known, is a report from 1971 by the American Friends Service Committee, who appointed a set of experts and former prisoners, and they appointed a committee, that very Quakerly thing that we do, to try and make a comment on what was going wrong in American prisons at the time. This was around the time of the Attica prison riots. It was the sort of end of the civil rights movement in America. And it was just before, it was the point when the American prison population reached its lowest level. It was just at the point before the kind of rise of mass incarceration as we now know it. And one of the things, what I found particularly interesting in this is that report argues very strongly, its strongest arguments, I think, are saved against the idea of rehabilitation as it was then implemented. And again, I think that's interesting because it kind of ran against, I knew about the report, but I'd never read it before I was preparing the lecture. And it sort of ran against my instincts. But I think what it is trying, the reason it makes those arguments is it's because of that kind of insidious blend of helping people with coercion that they objected to. And at the time, prisons have always harmed people and they have always failed to live up to the promises that they're going to reform people. But at the time, officially speaking, the aims of punishment, the kind of the policy language around imprisonment for a long time, up until the 1970s, had claimed that it was rehabilitating people and that the purpose of it was to rehabilitate people and change them and fix them to go out better than they were to start with. And the American Friends Service Committee were making the argument that this is just absolutely an unacceptable way to run a system of punishment, that you shouldn't aim to treat people, you shouldn't aim to rehabilitate them, that actually sentencing should reflect the seriousness of the crime, but the state has no business sitting in judgment over the content of people's characters, as it effectively does if you're making a parole board judgment about rehabilitation. And I just think that's really interesting. That was a very influential argument, which was actually taken advantage of by some people with much more punitive instincts, who then said, well, let's make the punishment fit the crime and let's ramp up the punishments as well, so we can then shut people away for a very long time. So the AFSC, just as much as those Philadelphia Quakers, there's a kind of tragedy of unintended consequences going on there. But yeah, they had this lovely phrase which sticks with me, and if you don't mind, I'll just sort of read it as well. This is from their report. And they were kind of trying to say that a lot of proposals to change prisons rely on the idea that if we make the prisons more rehabilitative, if we make them help people more, then that's going to fix the problem. And they said that's not going to fix the problem. And I still think this holds up today. They said many proposals that seem to urge the abolition of prisons are really exercises in label switching. Call them community treatment centres or what you will. If human beings are involuntarily confined in them, they are prisons. There is an easy test that can be applied to any purported abolition of punishment or imprisonment. Is the proposed alternative voluntary? Can the subject take it or leave it? If he takes it, can he leave it anytime he wants? If the answer to any of these questions is no, then the wolf is still under the sheepskin. And I think that's sort of, there's something really important in there. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in the lecture as well, about how I think that tension is really, really hard to avoid, and it's hard to reform away. And it's still there today. And I think it always has been there in the history of prisons and the history of punishment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's always, interesting when you get to hear a bit about how, Quaker history isn't always perfect, because you've got a lot of, it can often feel when you're reading stuff that Quakers come across as these perfect people who always did the right thing. And the histories are not as clear and black and white as that. There's a lot of stuff which is complicated. Yeah, so it's always good to...
It is complicated, but it's also important to acknowledge something about it, which is that when Philadelphia Friends were trying to invent penitentiaries, and they were trying to invent ways of responding to wrongdoing which reformed people, the alternative, the counterfactual that they were trying to reform out of existence, was hanging them or mutilating them. So I'm not trying to sort of say that makes everything okay. I don't think it tots up in this kind of neat accounting where it's like, well, that was bad, but this was a bit less bad, so it's all okay. I think what I'm in the same way when the American Friends Service Committee wrote their report, like I think absolutely everything they said holds up really, really well today. But the truth is that report was published the year before the American prison population stopped declining and turned a corner, and then multiplied by about 6 over about 40 years. So I think what it tells us is that there are some really, really intractable, what social scientists call wicked problems, which are problems that there isn't a clear solution. There are multiple competing agendas. Not everybody agrees what the problem is, let alone what the solution is. And I think that's a really difficult area to get involved in. It's a very easy area to kind of for I don't mean Quakers particularly, although we're included in this. I mean for citizens generally, just to kind of wash our hands of and try not to think about, because it's too difficult, and we just then leave it to the experts. We leave it to the governments as if it's just their problem to resolve. And so I don't want to, in highlighting those examples, I don't want to do down the achievements of reformers in the past, but I think it's really, really important to sort of be pretty suspicious of things that appear to be easy solutions in this field, and that's where the work that I've done has got me over the time that I've been doing it as well, is to feel a little bit suspicious of easy solutions. And what I would rather see is for people to be more involved in the problems and kind of contributing what they have to say, rather than just leaving it to the specialists or leaving it to the prison service or.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really looking forward to hearing the full lecture. And before we finish, is there one thing in particular you're looking forward to sharing with friends in your lecture?
Yeah, well, the thing that I'm most looking forward to sharing is what I think of as kind of the benefits of being up close. There is an American writer, he's a prison chaplain, and he's also a sociologist called Reuben Miller, who calls this the privilege of proximity. And what he's saying there, and I'll say more about this in the lecture, but what he's saying is that you can't grapple with really big, intractable problems by considering them from distance in an intellectual way as abstractions. You have to kind of understand that there are people involved, and that although abstractions are true, although it is true of some groups that they are riskier in terms of the harm that they might cause to others than other groups, that doesn't hold for every individual. People change, people are individual, and change can go forwards and backwards. Sometimes people backslide, sometimes people kind of what's the word? Sometimes people can make massive improvements on their lives, but then something can take it away. We are fragile as people, and so I think the thing that I'm looking forward to sharing, I've through a kind of particular set of experiences, which I'll say more about in the lecture. I've kind of been not only involved in this world as a researcher. I mean, the kind of research I do is quite human focused and quite close up, and is focused on talking to people and trying to understand the world as they see it, rather than simply the world as it's kind of perceived in official statistics or something. But yeah, through a particular set of experiences, I've developed a set of friendships, and those have kind of come to change some of how I see this as well. And I've had some experiences that I'll talk more about in the lecture. So yeah, the thing that I want to talk about and share is the privilege of proximity, and I want to advocate a little bit for people generally, but maybe particularly other Quakers, to find ways to get close.
Amazing. Yeah, we look forward to hearing it. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for speaking to us today.
Thank you.